God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Good morning.
Good morning.
Once again, it is my luck in life to follow Curry. I don't know how that happened, but it happened. Today is a kind of interesting day in the liturgical life of the church because it has multiple significances, largely because we use a different lectionary than the one that was in your 1979 Book of Common Prayer. In the old lectionary, this Sunday we would have heard the Gospel of the Annunciation to Mary. And that's why that rose-colored candle is lighted, because this is normally known as Mary Sunday. And there's all sorts of great Mary sermons that could get preached, but not with today's gospel. You can't, Mary doesn't even show up in today's gospel. It's also interesting because the collect for today, if you look at the collect that TJ said, begins with the words, stir up. And stir up Sunday used to be the last Sunday before Advent, when we asked God to stir the people up, and it was the time for the baking of Christmas pudding. That's what you did on Stir Up Sunday, okay? But it also is the Sunday that we refer to as Gaudete Sunday. Gaudete Sunday is the Latin word, gaudete is the Latin word for rejoice. And that, at last, we have some connection with the readings today, because the second lesson begins with the words, rejoice, I say to you, rejoice. And the reason for that is because Lent and Advent have often been compared as seasons, and that Advent is a time of penitence and penitential thinking, of looking inward, of preparing yourself for the coming of Christ. That's what you do in Advent. Lent is the time to prepare yourself for the gift of Holy Week and the gift of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so the people who were doing liturgy said, but they're really not the same. Lent is way more serious. So we need to interrupt Advent with something. So let's interrupt Advent with the idea that we need to rejoice. So this is Rejoice Sunday. I got to tell you that as I reviewed a bunch of my background and my history, one of the things that is true is that I've learned something from every congregation I've served. The first congregation I served actually was in the mountains of Puerto Rico. And it was a little church where in 1964, the average life expectancy up in the mountains was 38 years. These people were dirt poor. Nobody had floors. Nobody had indoor plumbing. And if it didn't rain, there was no water. And I thought to myself, as I think to myself always when have you seen those, the movies where, or the news reels where you go through some poor, usually African but not always, country, and all these people are there, and there's little babies with bloated bellies from hookworm, and there's no water, and the report is that Mrs. So-and-so walks 7 miles to get a tub of water to bring back, and as the camera goes by, they're all smiling. There's some capacity in the human spirit. There's something about us that we can find a reason to smile even in the worst of circumstances. And I learned that from those people because they came oftentimes without shoes, walking 4 miles to come to church on Sunday, just to be able to sing God's praises, just to be able to be the community of people called the Episcopal Church in Barrio Rubias de Jaujo. And then I had a congregation. I was the seminarian in a congregation in New York City. And it was a very liberal congregation. For all of you who are liberal, you don't know what liberal really is until you see these people. We actually, in 1969, ordained a woman, which we weren't allowed to do. And she did the Eucharist. And they did that as a protest against the fact that women weren't allowed to be priests. And what the church was a mission to actors. So the good news when you're a seminarian is it had one service at 12 o'clock noon. So you got to sleep in, which was great, you know. And these people would come from all walks of life. And they would come, and the church itself was a set for whatever play we were putting on. And my job was to lower the altar from the boom that was on top and lower the cross. And here were these people who were in all sorts and conditions of life. And for instance, Dustin Hoffman was a parishioner, you know? And then so was the guard at the tombs, who was later convicted of abusing the prisoners at the tombs. It was a mishmash of people, but they all came together on Sunday morning to sing God's praises. And there was a faith in them that was just as strong, very different, but just as strong as the faith of those people in Puerto Rico. And then I went out to a mega church. I mean, the first confirmation class I presented in this church was 125 children, 12 years old. No 13-year-olds, no 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds. And it was a huge church school. And people were coming from all over. And it was this glorious thing. And what was interesting about them is that this was suburban Long Island. In suburban Long Island, if any of you have been to Long Island or have been from Long Island, or if any of you have driven on the Long Island Expressway, you know that you've got to be tough. You've got to be direct, and you've got to fight for everything you get, including a place in line at the bank. I went to the same bank for 5 years, and every time I had to show my identification. But what I learned from them was that church really could do great things. They were active in their community. They were doing things all over the place. And if there was a disaster, they were the first people signed up. They also, and I've talked about them before, were the church that burned down. And the rector said to me afterwards, a church ought to burn down every 10 years. Because it brought them together. And I learned from the church I went to after that, miserable church. I didn't like them, they didn't like me. It should never have been built, this church. Seriously, it was on this beautiful piece of property, and there were 15 Episcopal churches within 5 miles. And who came to this church were all the people who didn't like the rector of the other 14 churches. And the only thing that saved me was the fact that they all left their church for different reasons. Because if they all left for the same reason, it would have really been difficult. They taught me. They taught me that you can be tough and you can not like one another. But something magical happens when you're at the altar rail together and you're kneeling and you're asking God to come into your heart. Something strange and wonderful happens. And then I went from there to a congregation that had conflict. You guys were rank amateurs at conflict. These people, literally, the aisle, all the people who were, it took them 10 years to fire my predecessor. 10 years. All the people on this side were for the rector, all the people on this side were against the rector, and where you sat mattered. And they worked hard. And they worked through a very difficult kind of reconciliation one with another till it finally got to be that they could kneel at the altar rail together and receive communion. They were among the smaller congregations in the diocese. When I left, it was the largest congregation in the diocese, not because of me, but because they did the hard work of reconciliation. They learned to forgive one another. They learned to forgive past actions so that presently they could be a strong community. And let me tell you something about those people. This Christmas, they have declared that St. Philip's Southport is their project. And all of the loose offering from Christmas Eve and and everybody else in the congregation is being encouraged to go to our GoFundMe page to help us through this jam. That's those people who didn't like each other. And then I had a series of congregations because I was working in the diocese, and I'd go to a different church almost every week. And I learned from people who were in big congregations how to be big, and I learned from people in small congregations how to be small. But over and over and over again, I kept learning that there's something in the people of God who are just like those people with babies with swollen bellies. There is a capacity to rejoice that is built into the fabric of what it means to be Christian. There's a capacity for joy. And I got to tell you, last Sunday, I learned from you how far a congregation can come between people who were upset to people who could laugh. Bishop Curry said to me when he left, he says, what I'm bringing to the rest of the church is there's no sad faces in Southport. And I've learned that from you, that your capacity to rejoice in the midst of, yeah, it's a tough time, is enormous. So on this Rejoice Sunday, I just want to suggest to you that you take a moment to give thanks to God for your capacity for joy. The things that make you joyful. I didn't say happy. Joyful. For some of us, it's our children. For some of us, it's our grandchildren. For some of us, it's our neighbors. For some of us, it's activities that we get to do. We're blessed to be able to do. But one thing that we share in common is the ability to rejoice in this place, at this time, in spite of everything. And that is the miracle of Christmas. Amen.
Amen.